Burkinis are back in Grenoble. Still prohibited in most French public pools, the city in southeastern France will allow all to wear what they want or don't want while they swim. I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. When the Grenoble City Council voted to allow full-body bathing suits in its public pools, there was a wave of celebrations in some sections of France. Just look at this.
Est adopté.
It's important. It means that now I have access to the pool. I haven't been in 10 years. This summer I'll be able to go there. It's incredible.
It's a question of freedom of choice, of being able to dress the way we want and have access to the public places and spaces.
But while some celebrated, others bemoaned what they see as regression.
After all the work and all the battles that have been fought to obtain gains for women, we feel that this is a step backwards.
Faced with this result, where 29 votes out of 59 have carried out a historic decision in Grenoble, we have decided to leave the municipal council in the face of this anti-democratic situation.
It's a kind of reversal of the concept of equality. We tell these women they won't be able to go to the swimming pool. But yes, they will be able to, simply by respecting the fact of wearing a swimsuit.
France's central government has also hit back. While regional authorities quickly suspended Grenoble's public funding, officials in Paris are now challenging the decision. The Interior Minister called the move unacceptable and attacked Grenoble's mayor. Posting to his more than 300,000 Twitter followers, he said,
Mr. Puyol, a supporter of Mr. Mélenchon, is unacceptably provoking the community. I have instructed the prefect to refer to the deliberation allowing the wearing of the burkini to secularism, and if it contradicts those values, to request its withdrawal.
Laurent Wauquiez from the center-right Republicans Party also condemned the Grenoble decision. He said the city had broken with secularism and the values of France, and he accused Éric Puyol of doing a deal with political Islam to gain votes. And then Alliance Citoyenne, the group that pushed to have the restrictions lifted, came under investigation. Now, of course, this isn't the first time a debate over the burkini has erupted in France. In 2016, several mayors tried to ban the full-body swimsuit from beaches in the Mediterranean. Things escalated when this image of armed police forcing a woman to remove part of her clothing spread online. And since then, many French Muslims feel they are being targeted.
It definitely comes from politicians from all parties, and then all the media talks about it non-stop and makes the atmosphere worse. The tension becomes more noticeable because of the media. In other countries, it absolutely doesn't happen like that, and there are no tensions with regard to Muslims. They clearly live in peace.
So what many consider a personal choice has seemingly become a political priority. So to discuss the conflict between religious freedom and secularism in France, I'm joined from London by French-Algerian journalist and broadcaster Nabila Ramdani. Max Begon also joins us from London. He is the UK representative of Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party. And completing our panel from New York is Dalia Fahmy. She is a Middle East analyst and associate professor of political science at Long Island University. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's start as simply as possible. Dalia, let me come to you. Do you welcome this change in Grenoble's legislation?
Of course, but I think we need to put it in a greater context of the role of identity in French politics and how this rising Islamophobia narrative comes to the forefront when we see election cycles happening in France, as we've seen earlier this year and last year. When we look at what the language of the resolution is that women can wear whatever they want, right? So they can either go topless or they can wear burkinis. So the language says that women have freedom of choice. And so we think about what this really means. Why is this highly politicized? Is that the question of Islam has long been a thorn in the French establishment side. And that's because because France has 5.7 Muslims, the largest Muslim concentration in all of Europe. And so the implications of what this means for French identity is a larger story of the politics of the day and the way that Macron and Le Pen have used the narrative of Muslims and immigration to fan their own election aspirations.
Okay, Nabila, I imagine you agree. This really does fit in with the election cycle in France.
Well, yes, indeed. And dare I say, this is another typical sinister polemic about women's clothes, which demeans France. I mean, the war in Ukraine is intensifying, and monkeypox, which is another very frightening disease, is coming into the international consciousness to join coronavirus. And yet France is still obsessing about the burkini and how it can be outlawed effectively. And the so-called Muslim dress always provokes a summer polemic, and the latest has seen the Grenoble Council allowing women to cover up in swimming pools, leaving the government absolutely fuming at an alleged attack on secular and republican values. And in my view, not only are these angry arguments terribly misplaced, but they're also offering nothing except hate and division. Again, we're talking at a time when the world is still dealing with a crisis such as coronavirus. We would think that France would have moved on from nonsense like this, especially when there's a war going on in Ukraine, but it really hasn't. And beyond massive global problems, there is a cost of living crisis in France and all kinds of other economic and social worries. And yet, here we have a so-called liberal democracy tearing itself apart over what women choose to wear. And it's not some eccentric lobbying group, but the French government itself, which is challenging the Grenoble Council's decision to allow bathers to wear the burqa.
Let me ask you specifically about something. Why was it that when the city of Rennes was allowing for burkinis to come back to public pools, there was no real backlash about that? That kind of flew under the radar. While Grenoble has become this huge political issue, it's on all French talk shows, and Rennes wasn't made as much of a political issue of. Why is that?
Well, it's the Interior Minister himself now, Gérald Darmanin, who says that the move from the Grenoble Council to allow women to wear a full-body swimsuit effectively amounts to an unacceptable provocation that goes against the values of the secular republic. And he announced that he would seek to do everything to block it. And remember that France considers itself the home of human rights and, of course, liberty, equality, and fraternity. And yet it is still obsessing over dress. And this opposition to the burkini is entirely political. We've got reactionaries from left to right who see it as a symbol of creeping Islamism, as they put it, which is to say that there are too many Muslims in France in their view.
So, Max, why do you feel this is actually an important issue for France? It's not just about political maneuvering and playing types of political games.
Well, it's a very important issue because we have seen in the 20th century history, but in situations where you have different religions inhabiting the same country, if you don't have a strong system in place to avoid conflict, then it can easily degenerate in civil war like it did in Algeria and in Lebanon. And this is something we want to avoid at all costs for our country. We also in France have seen terrorist attacks every year for at least 7 or 8 years. So it's not like a problem, but it's in the air. We are facing people dying every year because of Islamic fundamentalism. And allowing the burkini in swimming pool is not just giving a freedom to Muslim women that would want to wear it. It's also going against the freedom of anyone who is going to a swimming pool and doesn't want to be subjected to Islamic propaganda. So when you talk about freedom, you have to take into aspect everyone's freedom, not just the freedom of the people who are choosing to display their religion in a public place.
Then I need you to explain Dahlia actually alluded to this. The regional chief above the mayor of Grenoble actually says that the city's funding has now been withdrawn because he believes this Green Party mayor is doing deals with political Islam. I mean, how can he be catering to political Islam when the law also allows both men and women to swim topless?
Well, I think this is a very similar situation to the integral veil. So in 2010, there was a law that was voted to ban the integral veil in public places, and the reasoning behind it was similar in that it's a way that fundamentally Islamists use to promote their ideology, and if we allow this to happen, it's the beginning of separatism, it's communitarism, it's proselytism, and it's not a good thing for either French people or for Muslim people living in France, because it will just make their integration much more difficult. And if you are a young Muslim woman now, and that if you didn't have these laws that ban burkini, well, there is no law against burkini yet, but if you didn't have this law that ban integral veil, then it might be a lot of them would have to wear this integral veil, and it would be really difficult for them to integrate in French society as they could.
Okay, Dali, I know you've heard that argument before when they say they believe it's a good thing for Muslim women in France to enact these laws so that women are protected. I'll let you respond to that as a Muslim woman yourself.
So it's interesting that we continue to talk about the policing of women's bodies and women's clothing as measures of freedom. And we're putting now France in the category of Iran that also forces women to wear. And so France is going to be forcing women to disrobe. And so we need to ask ourselves, why is it that the policing of women's bodies, especially Muslim women, are indicators of identity? If we take a larger step back, we talk about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment, it's not a fear of Islam and Muslims, but it's about the marginalization of Muslims from civic and political life. According to Pew, in 2014, 72% of French people had a positive view of Islam and Muslims. Today, it's been reduced significantly. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is it that the rise of populism and populist sentiment and rhetoric against narratives of identity of Muslims belonging in France have come from the political establishment to cause division and social strife, which could lead to social strife? The previous commentator talked about Algeria and Lebanon. The causes of conflict in Algeria and Lebanon were not religion and weren't Burkini. It was the creation of unequal citizenship. And so if France is moving in the direction of policing women's bodies, creating an in-group and out-group of who belongs to the nation, then we could be moving in a direction where France is in the categories of countries like Iran, where there is indeed unequal citizenship for women.
Okay, Nabila, I have to ask you something on more of a micro level here. In that once these laws are enacted, I believe it comes into effect on June 1st, do you expect to see certain kind of provocations, I'll call them that, at the ground level here, if or when women who actually resent burkinis will perhaps purposely go topless, knowing that it could disturb more conservative Muslim women and their children who come to these public pools, for example? Because it seems like there is a level with the populism and the population itself that does resent seeing burkinis in their public spaces.
Well, dare I say, you know, the biggest provocation in all that, it comes from the government. I mean, women are entitled to wear what they like in swimming pools. I mean, the government had raised the issue of hygiene previously to ban the burkini. The irony is hygiene in France is pretty primitive. If you walk into streets in France, you will notice that straight away. And it's no different in swimming pools. I can assure you of that in France. But the biggest provocation is the arguments, the insidious arguments put forward by the government, including secularism, which is being weaponized by the political class to clamp down on Muslims. Secularism is in fact meant to allow religious expression, and secularism laws certainly say nothing about swimming pool or indeed beachwear. The truth is that the entire political system in France, left and right, has been rallying against Muslims for years. And this contrived fashion debate is yet another example of the insidious tactics. They were very successfully honed by Nicolas Sarkozy, the former conservative president, who in 2010 introduced a so-called burqa ban to keep his xenophobic base very happy. And remember that the far right has just had yet another successful presidential election, and with parliamentary elections coming up, Macron and his ministers are very keen to keep them happy. Sarkozy's reasoning was that the face coverings were worn by a handful of women, mainly converts to Islam on housing estates, required a vicious national debate. And without providing a shred of evidence, he managed to criminalize wearers of the niqab, a black garment that draped over the entire body except for the eyes and the hands, by linking it with all kinds of potential threats, including terrorism. And by the by, and to the delight of the bigots, Muslims in general were made to feel like an alien subspecies, detested and pilloried because of what a tiny minority of them looked like.
Right.
And this is the danger.
Again, Max, this is not felt by Muslim women themselves, that this is in any way about protecting their interests or their dignity, as some in power like to argue, including your party. But let me ask you this. I mean, this legislation only passed by a razor-thin margin, and some, actually, including the former mayor of Grenoble, are now pushing for a local referendum. Do you think such a vote could help solve the problem or easily exacerbate it?
Well, it's always a good thing to ask the local population what they want instead of making assumptions. But generally, a principle we support in the National Rally. But to put some perspective on the various laws that have been voted to ban, for example, integral veil. These laws have been voted by elected representatives of the French people, so they represent the opinion of the majority of the French people, and I think that's something that's very important. Like, if the French people don't want people to wear integral veil in the public space, then people should not be wearing integral veil in the public space. That's the most important thing, the sovereignty of the French people.
Can I ask you, Max, though, if somebody chose to wear a big Roman Catholic cross on their chest, noticeably so, would you reject that as well?
Yeah, we're completely against this kind of proselytism. And clearly, if someone was doing this in a swimming pool, he would probably be expelled pretty quickly.
Okay, interesting. Dalia, do you think that's the case, really? Do you think the French would be as easily offended by people wearing large crosses around their necks?
No, because those that are most Islamophobic are also saying that France has an inherent Christian identity. And so it's not about secularism as no religion in the public sphere. It's no Muslims and Islam in the public sphere. And we need to really be understanding of how this comes from the top and not from the ground root. Because as I said before, statistically speaking, most French people have historically been acceptable. Macron in 2017 ran on a platform of inclusivity and at a modern liberal society that embraces multiculturalism. That's how he came into power. But what we're seeing today is that the political narrative requires the rise of xenophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment for the political establishment to continue as it is. And so we saw the not just centering, but the moving to the right of even the left. And so it's not about whether you're wearing a cross or a hijab or a burkini or a yarmulke in the pool. It's really about the symbolic exclusion of a 5.7 million people in France for the sake of the political establishment to continue as it is and move even further to the right. It's not just happening in France, it's happening throughout the world, including here in the United States. And we need to be aware of the global problem of the rising populist narrative.
Right. You are in the United States, Dalia. Let me ask you if you think this issue is France's version, more or less, of the white replacement theory, whereby conservative white French people kind of see themselves being demographically potentially replaced by Muslim immigrants in their case.
We just had a mass shooting last week in Buffalo, New York, where the alleged shooter had a manifesto where it was looking particularly for the most densely populated areas of African Americans. We've seen this also in Christchurch in New Zealand. We're seeing this narrative of exclusion being so palpable that it's leading to violence, and it's leading to extreme violence here in the United States, where just in the month of May, from January to May, we've had over 200 mass shootings. When we think about what the narrative and the rhetoric, the Burkini ban, or this legislation, if it passes nationally in France, is going to lead to violence because of the political rhetoric. Just as we see here in the United States, we had the anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Muslim rhetoric, anti-Semitic rhetoric in the last administration, and in all three of those spheres, we saw a rise in violence. And so we need to be aware when we see political legislation and elected officials speaking in an Islamophobic context, those that suffer the most are going to be the symbols of Islam. Women who cover and mosques. And we have seen those two increasingly attacked in places like France.
Max, do you see those parallels between France and the United States?
No, I think it's a very different context just because the number of weapons that are in free circulation in the US is vastly superior. So I am glad we don't have as many weapons in France. I would just like to mention that there was a poll 2 years ago that said that 74% of under 25 French Muslims put their Islamic faith ahead of French Republic values. So when you talk about Islamophobia, when you have this kind of situation where citizens living in a country put their own religious values ahead of the values of the country, you cannot stay inactive. You have to act to change that because it's not a sustainable situation. But if you start with this kind of opinion at 25, that's the recipe for separatists, communitarists, and eventually one day civil war. So we are acting not because we don't like Muslim people, but because we want to avoid violence and war.
Dolly, go ahead.
If I can just interject on that one statistic, that was in the context of internalized Islamophobia. Young people in France that are Muslim find themselves increasingly disenfranchised, so they have internalized the Islamophobic narrative that they indeed don't belong. And when you feel like the country is telling you you don't belong, you will move to a different system of values as an indicator. And so when we think about that statistic, we need to put it in a greater context of that research. That research was talking about internalized Islamophobia and how young Muslim French individuals are increasingly feeling like the country is telling them that they don't belong.
Nabila, we just have a minute left. I want to give you some time for final words. Go ahead.
Well, I have to say that the truth is that those who rally against the behavior of ethnic and religious minorities they dislike are seldom able to hide their bigoted and indeed racist motivations. It was only a few years ago that the French women's rights minister, Laurence Rossignol, compared Muslim women who dared to shop in the so-called Islamic garment market to Negroes who supported slavery, her words. And the truth is that the burkini is just a flimsier version of a wetsuit, but to her, and to many like her, it's an unacceptable manifestation of a faith that allegedly locks up bodies, and it is thus a perfect example to demonize the followers of this faith. And you have even a ludicrous situation where French feminists, not all of them, it has to be said, are now even want to castigate Muslims who want to wear anything that may have religious associations, however spurious they might be. And they even object to those who simply cover their head with a headscarf, like Queen Elizabeth II when she goes out with her horses. So laboring a divisive debate about clothes so as to stigmatize a distinct community becomes part of a dehumanizing agenda championing the politics of exclusion. Right. And the truth, members of France's 5 million plus minority should absolutely have the freedom to wear what they like.
Unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists, Dalia Fahmy, Nabila Ramdani, and Max Begon, so much for joining us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.